Good morning, guys. I want us to go ahead and get started on our review process. We want to make sure that we're all on the same foundation and the same starting place. So we're going to really quickly review some of the information that you should have from U.S. History 8th grade, which was the first section of U.S. History. So hopefully you can see the screen here. We'll go through the PowerPoint. Please make sure that as we do notes throughout however long we're doing online, that you guys are taking notes. You're going to need these notes. Remember, you are still going to have to be responsible for the STAR test as of right now, which means that some of that information that's on that STAR test actually comes from your 8th grade information. So we want to make sure that we have that information down. And that's information that we're building on as we start the second section. So we're going to go over the review first. So this should be information that you've heard before, but you do need to make sure you're taking notes over it. All right. So please make sure that you're note taking and that you have that. The best way to do it, guys, is just to get you a spiral notebook and put all of our notes in that spiral notebook and just keep them all year long. And then when we get ready for reviews, for tests and reviews for the STAR test, you can always go back and look at your notes. All right. So please make sure that you're taking notes and that you're writing things down as we go through the information. Okay. All right. We want to start with the very beginning. So we're going to go way back to the before North America was even colonized. We know that this part of the world is where our Native Americans are going to be able to find their roots. The first people to settle in North America migrated from Asia. They migrated across a land bridge during the last ice age. That land bridge you can see in the picture here, the Bering Land Bridge that basically connected North America with the Asian world. And that allowed for those that were looking for food and searching for food to be able to cross into North America. And so that's what that migration allowed these different peoples from all across the other continent, that Asian continent, to be able to cross into North America. So it is a diverse group that's coming in, even though we kind of lump them all together as Native Americans. They're still considered more of a diverse group. So as the Native Americans began to cross over and begin to spread across North America and then move south into what today is Middle America or Mexico, Latin America, and into South America. And so this group is going to begin to migrate all the way through North, Middle, and South America. The Native Americans are going to develop very diverse cultures throughout the continent. This is something you learned in world geography. The fact that you have people adapting to their climates and to where they are settling down. So if I live on the East Coast of what's North America as a Native American group, I'm going to probably have more fish, and I'm going to do fishing and those types of things. So the housing, the way that they dress, the languages that they develop, the religion that they have are all going to differ from different tribes. And so as I move across North America, I'm going to see a diverse collection of different ideas. I'm going to see different religions. Many of them are going to develop into farmers. Some of them are going to be fishing communities. Some of them are going to be nomadic, which means that they're going to roam or move from place to place, basically following buffalo across Middle America and the southern portion of the United States. And so they'll develop their cultures over a course of time. So this is what America would look like prior to the colonization portion that will begin as the Europeans move into what they call the New World. Okay? Our European exploration and settlement, this is what we call the New World. Christopher Columbus, who was beginning or looking for a westward route to Asia, is going to come across this area, and he is going to open the door to the New World. Now, we know that Christopher Columbus doesn't actually discover North America, but he is the one that opens the door to the trade and what we'll see as the actual route of the Europeans coming into this new world. And so he is given a lot of credit for the discovery. Now, we know that the Vikings were here, and we know that there are Native Americans that are already established in their tribes and so forth. But we still say, that he discovers the New World. And he doesn't just make one trip. Christopher Columbus is going to make multiple trips from the New World back into the European continent. And because of that, he literally opens up this exchange that happens between the new and the old worlds. And so we call it the Columbian Exchange. And it's basically just a transfer of people and plants, animals, even diseases that we begin to move back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean as more and more people start to see or start to have that travel going from the northern continent or the European continent into North America. And then once they're in North America, they don't just stop in areas like Cuba and just sit there. They're going to expand. They're going to move out into these other areas. And so that's where they'll begin the exploration process. And so they're going to start exploring. And once they start exploring, they're going to come in contact with Native American groups, different tribes, different peoples across the continent. Okay, and that is going to include Latin America, Middle America, and North America. The European nations are going to see this new world as an opportunity to gain land, to gain riches, to gain converts to their different religions. And so you're going to see more and more movement towards that new world. And the European nations, remember at this time, you're talking about the 15 and 1600s. Actually, when Columbus comes in, we're talking about the end of the 1400s. So you're looking at 1492 and moving forward. And so that time period you're seeing lots of civilizations that are created. So you have European civilizations like the British, the Dutch, the French, the Spanish. Those are civilizations. In other words, most of them have monarchs. You're going to see that they have a king or a queen, and because they're in Europe, they're landlocked into that civilization. But this is a time period where all of these nations are expanding and searching and exploring and trying to increase what their civilization has, right? And so you have to understand, remember, when you look at history, always look at it from the perspective of the people living in that time. If you take 21st century ideals and you put them in 1492, then you are doing a disservice to the history of that time period. Because you always want to look at it from their perspective. So you're looking at a time period from the 1400s into the 1600s, where this is all about exploring. This is looking for new things that they had never seen before, people that they did not know existed, cultures they had never heard of, languages, religions. All of this is new to these travelers. And so these European nations began to compete with one another, because one of the greatest things that you could do in this time period was own land. Land was the most important thing. You had to own land if you wanted to be considered wealthy. So these nations wanted to have control and to claim these new lands. So as Columbus comes in and he opens up that travel, he opens up that exploration, all the other civilizations in Europe, all these other nations in Europe began to compete with each other, trying to claim this different land. And so you're going to see Spain, you're going to see the French, the British, the Dutch, all of these different civilizations competing with one another. Now, as we move into U.S. history, I know that you guys heard all of this in world history, and you probably heard it in your first section of U.S. history as well. But for our purposes, we're going to talk specifically about the English, because our history, the American history, is really tied to English history, because that's really where our colonies are going to be tied to. The English will control the area of the country that will eventually become the first section or the colonies or the first states of the United States. All right. So the very first permanent English settlement is Jamestown. Jamestown is the English settlement in Virginia. Now you can see in the bottom of your screen right here, this little picture that has the triangle. That is a map of what the very first English settlements would have looked like. So they're not these massive cities. They're these small settlements, small villages that are depending on each other for protection. They're depending on each other to make sure that they're following the same rules, that they're feeding each other, they're helping each other. So this is kind of what a map of what the first settlements may have looked like, right? So settlers are going to come to America in the early 1600s, all the way through the 17 and 1800s, mainly for the idea of having the ability to practice freedom of religion. They want to be able to practice their religion in the way they want to. Because in England, the English church was telling them exactly how they could worship. And they didn't like that. And they thought that there was corruption within the church itself, because the church was becoming much more secular and much more tied to the monarch or the king than to what the first settlers in the New World believed they should have been more relying more on the Bible. And so they wanted to be able to practice that religion with more freedom. And so you know the story. They're going to leave England. They end up in the Dutch area, and then from there, because they're being persecuted, they're going to leave there and they're going to take this voyage to the New World. And they're going to take this huge, huge chance to be able to start over. Now, one of the things that you're going to see about history is tied to economics, because a lot of the reason that people do things is for economic purposes. So we say, people came to the New World because they wanted to start over. They wanted to have a chance at a new life. Well, basically that means that they wanted economic opportunities. Many of those that were living in Europe at the time, whether you were French, Dutch, English, you were tied to a system that didn't allow you to move up socially within that system. And so if you were the youngest son, you weren't going to get anything. Everything that the father owned or the family owned was going to be passed to the eldest son. So that was property, finances, whatever that family owned would be passed to the oldest son, which means that the youngest son usually didn't receive property and ownership. And so he really doesn't have a chance to be able to move up in society. And so seeing this new world with all of this unexplored land available meant that you had this new opportunity. And so that's what we're going to see a pull for many of the European exploration and settlement that's going to take place. A lot of them see this as their chance to be able to make something socially and economically of their lives. And so they're willing to take this trip across the Atlantic Ocean, this extremely dangerous trip that you could die in the process. You could die before you ever saw the New World on these ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean. But so many of these people were willing to take that chance. And most of it was for religious purposes and for economic purposes that we're going to see this exchange. All right. And so as you see the colonies begin to develop in the New World, remember our colonies, which are going to be along the eastern coast of the United States, are what will become the United States. Those eastern coast colonies are tied to mainly Great Britain. So when the colonization starts, there's some movement back and forth between, especially the Dutch and the French and the English. But eventually what happens is the British end up having control of the east coast of North America. The Spanish are more in that southern portion. So they're like in that Florida area, from Florida to Louisiana. That area of today, you would see more of the Spanish. And then, of course, with the Louisiana, you're going to see the French impact there. And so the French are going to be in control of those sections of the land, right? And then, of course, the Spanish will have the Middle America. You have more Spanish exploration into areas like that today are Mexico and those types of areas in Middle America. And so you'll see that that influence there from the Spanish. Now we're going to move forward. Remember, this is supposed to be kind of a review, so hopefully this is all sounding familiar to you. If you were in my classroom right now, I would ask you to tell me, what exactly does all this sound familiar, so that I could get some feedback from you. Okay, so we're gonna have to move forward a little bit. But remember, if you ever have questions over any of this, you can always email me, use your Canvas account, or you can email me through the regular Midland ISD account. Okay. All right, so let's move towards independence. So in 1754 to 1763, we have what's called the French and Indian War. Again, if you were in class, I would ask you, who's involved in the French and Indian War, all right? It is the French and the Indians, but the French and the Indians are on the same side. This is basically a war between the British and the French. And the French have been able to get the Native American tribes on their side. So the French and the Native Americans are fighting together against the British, right? So, a lot of people, they'll say, well, who's in the French and Indian War? And people say, oh, well, the French and the Indians. Well, yeah, but they're basically on the same side. So it's basically Native Americans and French against the British, right? And so since this is a war that's dealing with Great Britain, the colonies in in North America are involved in this conflict. And like you learned with the French and Indian War, what you have is these two major world powers, the French and the British, trying to take control over the new world. Both of them want to have control of this new world, mainly because of the massive amount of resources that the new world has to offer. And so that's why you're going to see that these two civilizations will continue to fight with one another, right? Now, it's actually the French and Indian War is actually a portion of a larger war that's going on between the French and the British in Europe, right? So this is what's going to spread over into the colonies or the New World. Now, what we'll see with the French and Indian Wars, this is kind of the first time that the colonists are having to deal with British issues. The British are going to have to send British troops to the colonies to defend those colonies against the French and the Native American attacks. And so because of that, they start taxing the colonies. So they need help paying for this war. So they start taxing the colonies and expecting the colonists to help pay for this war. Now the colonists, they feel like they're being overtaxed, that they're not receiving any kind of representation or any kind of voice in the British Parliament overseas with the king. And so the colonists are getting upset about how the British are treating them. The British are trying to gain money to pay for the war that defended the colonies. That's a very simplified version of that. Okay, so I know that you guys have had a more in-depth lessons on those with your world history classes. Okay, but by 1765, one of the things that the British have done is they've implemented all these new taxes. You have the Stamp Act in 1765, the Townshend Acts in 1767. And so the colonists are getting kind of upset with these types of taxes that are being placed on them. Because remember, these are taxes that are being placed on the colonists. They're not being placed on those that are living in Europe, in Great Britain. And so they're a little upset that they're having to have to pay all of these taxes. So the colonists begin to boycott British goods. Okay, now remember, a boycott just means that you are going to refuse to buy something from a certain group or company. And so we're going to boycott British goods, which means that we're going to stop in the colonies. We're going to stop buying goods that were made in Great Britain. And so if that's a British pair of shoes, we're not going to buy it. Okay. And so the Townshend Acts, because of the boycott, the Townshend Acts are repealed in 1770. But the colonists are still upset because other taxes are still in place. Then you start to see these events that take place. There's some unrest that's happening in the colonies. What you really have to understand about the British colonies is the British made a really, really big mistake in dealing with the colonies when the colonies were first established. So when we started seeing the establishment of these British colonies in the 16 and early 1700s, late 1500s, when you started seeing this, the British Crown basically left them alone and let them develop on their own. And so because of that, what you had is a group of people living in this new world that really aren't answering to the British Crown. Now, they consider themselves British subjects, but they're making their own rules in the colonies. And they start getting used to, by the 1770s, they're very used to, yeah, there's some things that we have to answer to for Britain, but they're basically ruling themselves, right? And so the taxes was something that caused some unrest because it was something now all of a sudden the British are forcing the colonists into. You're also seeing more and more British soldiers showing up in the colonies, which is something that the colonists, again, is causing unrest within the colonies. And so these things that are happening, people are starting to talk about, do we really need Great Britain? Do we have to be a part of Great Britain? And so you're starting to feel the tension and unrest begin to build in the colonies by the 1770s. And so you have some major events that take place. One of them is the Boston Massacre in 1770. Now, the Boston Massacre is something where you're going to see throughout history, the media has a big part in how things happen and why we view things the way we do and certain events. The media is something that has always impacted what happens in history. And it doesn't matter what country you're a part of. Okay. Now, the media in the 1770s is the written word. So you're looking at newspapers and pamphlets that are printed up and moved from different colonies, sent out to populations. The cities that we had by the 1770s, you always had printing presses there that were printing things up, and you had these pamphlets and these newspapers that were printed. And so that's where people got their news, by word of mouth or through the newspapers or the pamphlets that were being passed around. And so what happens in Boston is you have an incident where you have some British soldiers. The British soldiers are basically, defending an armory or protecting an armory that's there in Boston. You have some people that are walking by and they start, yelling at the British soldiers, talking to them, calling them names. Someone throws something at one of the soldiers that's there, and one of the British soldiers fires his weapon. And so what happens is this small group turns into this massive group of people. The soldiers are afraid, and someone fires into the crowd. Now, once someone fires the weapon, usually what happens is others follow suit, and that's exactly what's going to happen. And so the British troops will fire into the crowd. Now, what sounds like a massacre, remember, a massacre means that you have a group that's unarmed that has come in and basically been wiped out. Okay, so you can have it that way. You can also have a massacre where you have two groups that are fighting with one another, maybe on a battlefield. One group has an upper hand and is able to basically wipe out the other group. So a massacre, it depends on how you view the word massacre, right? So it can either be a military massacre where you just wipe out the other side, or you can have an unarmed group. In this case, the way that the newspapers wrote about it, it made it sound like you just had these young men that were walking down the street minding their own business, and the British soldiers that were there attacked them and killed them. And so now what we have are Americans or colonists that feel like they're being attacked by the British. So you do see the increase of taxes. You see an increase of military superiority there, our military presence in the colonies. And now you have this event where colonists have been killed by the British. right? And so the unrest and the tension continues to grow in the colonies. Then you have in 1773 the Boston Tea Party. Now, the Boston Tea Party is a true protest. So, whereas the Boston Massacre is something that just kind of happens, and it angers a lot of colonists, and people are still angry about the Boston Massacre by 1773. The Boston Tea Party is a coordinated protest. All right. So, what we'll see is you're going to see a group of men. They are going to board the British ships that are located in the Boston Harbor. They will board those ships. Now, remember, guys, this is not anything of violence. So they're not attacking the ships. They're not killing anybody. This is a protest to send a message to the British about the taxes and how they feel that they're being treated shamefully by the British. All right, so they will sneak aboard. They will take the tea that's on board. Remember, tea is a huge commodity that comes from Britain to the colonies. And they are going to dump the tea into the Boston Harbor. Okay, and so you can see the picture that's right there in the middle. You can see them dumping it over into the Boston Harbor. Now, remember, this is an attempt to send a message to the crown, to the king, that they don't like the way they're treated. They're being treated in the colonies. And so they will have the Boston Tea Party. Well, the Tea Party does send a message, all right. The king gets the message loud and clear, and it angers him. And so he decides, you know what? I'm not going to have people rebelling against my crown. And so the parliament in Britain is going to pass what the Americans called the Intolerable Acts. And the Intolerable Acts will be passed by the British, basically to punish the colonists for the Boston Tea Party, for their protests, their actions of throwing the tea into the Boston Harbor. Now, this is something that actually has the opposite effect of what the British want. So the British are mad and angry, and they want to make sure that the colonists understand their place, that they understand that they're just colonists and they don't have rights and they don't have the ability to do this to the British crown. And so the idea was to punish them, and then they would become submissive to the British crown once again. The problem is it has the opposite effect. When the Intolerable Acts are passed, which basically, guys, is just kind of more taxes that they're placing on the colonists, telling them that they're not allowed to do certain things or have certain things, those types of things. And that's why the colonists calls them the Intolerable Acts. And so instead of, making the colonists or the American colonists submissive, the colonies are united with one another in their anger against the British monarch. And so the colonists, the American colonists, begin to talk about this idea of independence. Okay, now remember, this whole time, even during the Boston Tea Party, people were talking about liberty and people were talking about freedom, but you don't necessarily have people talking about we're going to become our own country. And so once the Intolerable Acts are passed, now you start to hear people saying the word independence, freedom, liberty, things that they want to be, where they want to be independent and to not have to answer to anybody other than a government they established themselves, right? So what the British had done actually has the opposite effect. And so in 1774, you can see the picture right here with George Washington in the middle. The colonists in America are going to meet at what we call the First Continental Congress in 1774. Now, the First Continental Congress is basically men from the different colonies coming together, leaders from those colonies coming together, representing those colonies, and talking about independence. This idea that maybe we could break away from Great Britain, right? So the colonies talked about it. What is something that you would have to do? Well, if you're going to break away, if you're going to become independent, one of the things you're going to have to do is you're going to have militias. right? Remember, militias are volunteer groups, military volunteer groups. So these are men that will volunteer a certain amount of years, usually, to serve in these militia groups to protect their colonies. And so they talk about the forming of the militias. And then the big event that happens in 1775 with Lexington and Concord. So remember, all of this unrest has built itself up. The British are angry. They've sent all these British troops into the colonies. The colonies are now mad about the fact that you have all these troops. You have these new taxes. You have someone who's basically come in and you have been able to rule yourself for so long, and now you have the British crown coming in saying, nope, we're going to take over and you're going to do what we tell you to do. Well, you're naturally going to see an uprising. And so in 1775, Lexington and Concord happens. Now, Lexington and Concord is important because this is what's known as the shot heard around the world. It's actually two different battles because it's two different places. Lexington is basically a small village, and the Concord is a small village, but they're very close together. And so the British march down to Lexington. They know that the colonists have established militias, and they know that in Lexington that the colonists are hiding gunpowder and weapons. And so they're going to march down there and take those away from the colonists to show the power of the British military. And so they march down to Lexington. Well, the colonists now have word that the British are marching towards them. So the colonists actually move some of that gunpowder and some of the weapons away from Lexington and move them towards the village of Concord. And so long story short, what happens is you have basically a skirmish that breaks out as the British march up. The militia groups hear about them marching up, and the militia groups begin to set up. Now, you know, in the 1770s, the way that battles are fought are not like we fight them today. You're not looking at where you have, remember, there's no aircrafts, there's nothing like that in 1775. So they march their army up against their other army in an open field, and they start firing at each other. And then they try to outsmart one another, and then they get closer and they try to push the other group back. If they can't push the other group back, they'll meet in the middle of the field, and there will be hand-to-hand combat. Okay? So with Lexington and Concord, as the British begin to move towards the militia groups, the colonists line up and begin firing at the British. And so they do push the colonists back, and they begin to retreat towards Concord. But the idea here, the importance of Lexington and Concord is the fact that Americans are now willing to fight for liberty, and not only fight for liberty, but to spill blood. In other words, they're willing to die for this cause. And that's a huge, huge event and a turning point, because it's no longer just words. It's no longer, like the First Continental Congress, where they're talking about liberty and they're talking about freedom and they're talking about independence. No, Lexington and Concord means that you're putting it into action. You have men that are willing to die for this independence. You have men that are willing to put everything on the line to make sure that they are able to have freedom against who they see as an oppressor. Right? So that's why it's known as the shot heard around the world, because this is basically the beginning of America. Okay, this is the beginning of what we know as America, the United States, because now these are folks that are going to put everything on the line, including their lives, to fight against the British to actually become independent. All right, so this is a huge, huge step towards that independence. Okay, so now what we're going to look at is, once you have blood spilled, you know that the skirmishes are happening. The British are beginning to send more troops into the New World, into the colonies. Now, not to defend the colonies, but to make sure they put down the uprising that they see in the colonies. And so that's something that has changed over the course of the years. Like when we were talking about the French and Indian War, now by 1775, the British are basically fighting their own people, all right? Because those living in the colonies still consider themselves British subjects, right? And so now what you have is this talk of independence. So you have the Second Continental Congress, which elected George Washington as the head of the Continental Army. And I so hope, guys, that you in your 8th grade history classes got to talk about George Washington and all the things that he had to go through just to be able to lead this army. It's not, it can be, when we talk about it, we have to talk about it so quickly that we don't get to tell you all the ins and outs of the things that had to happen for him to be actually elected as the leader of the Continental Army. There were other people that wanted to lead that Continental Army. But he was elected, and now he has to deal with basically a non-existent army. All right, so he's the leader of it, but there's really not a true military that's associated with the United States, all right? Because the United States really doesn't exist yet. Now, what he has to do is he has to take all of these different volunteers and all these different militia groups from all the different colonies, and he has to try to create a military to take on the most powerful military in the world. Okay, remember the British, they've defeated the French. The French are still a major power in the world, but the British have really become the major power because the British basically control the seas, the oceans, because of their navy. And so here's George Washington. He has to take a bunch of this group of these little ragtag guys. Some of them never had to fight. They've never killed anybody. They've never been on a battlefield. They have zero military training. They can fire a weapon because they hunt and protect their homesteads. But as far as military, they don't have any kind of background in the military. So here's George Washington, and he has to take all of these different groups of people, and he has to try to create something unified enough to take on the largest, most powerful military in the world of that time. Right? So he's elected as the leader of the Continental Army. You also have those that are going to start to spread the fire, this desire of independence. Because remember, a lot of colonists still consider themselves British. We're British subjects. What are we doing? We're part of Great Britain. And so you have people that were instrumental in fanning the flames of independence and fanning the flames of this idea that we are going to be independent and free from Great Britain. And so Thomas Paine writes a pamphlet. Remember, I told you that the way that they spread word, the way they spread ideas and were able to get people to listen to different ideas was through either the newspapers or pamphlets that they would print up. Thomas Paine prints up a pamphlet known as Common Sense. And in it, he talks about, what liberty is and what independence would be and how important it is that we unite together against this great oppressor of Great Britain, of the king. We have to separate ourselves from this king. And so he's kind of fanning the flames with his words, and that his pamphlet is being passed from colony to colony and person to person. And then Thomas Jefferson is going to be selected to write a draft of a declaration. Now, remember, a declaration just means I'm declaring something. This is what we're saying. This is what we're going to do, right? So I'm making a declaration. I'm declaring something. And in this case, we are declaring independence, right? Thomas Jefferson is an amazing writer. Right? And you can talk whatever about his life, so forth. This is his contribution to American history, or the fact that he is going to be one of the writers of the draft of the Declaration of Independence. He is the main writer. Are there other people that give ideas? Yes. Do they have rough drafts? Yes. Or you can see that he's marked things out. He rewrites it. So we do know that this wasn't just written up in an instant. This is something he had to work on, and he had to go back to and revise. And people would read it, and he would change words. And so he writes the Declaration of Independence, right? Any world history teacher will tell you the Declaration of Independence is one of the most well-written documents in world history. So this is not just something that's American. This is something that other countries will look at. And we'll tell you the same thing about the Constitution when we talk about it. People will look at this, other groups, as they move towards ideas of independence on their own. One of the things that they will go back to is the American Declaration of Independence, because it's so well written. And basically, guys, what your independence, the Declaration of Independence is doing is it's telling the king, look, we asked you to talk to us. We asked you to give us representation in the British Parliament. We asked you to treat us as true subjects of the crown. And you continued to treat us as second class. And so we will now rise up and declare that we are independent of your oppression, and we will fight for that independence. So the Declaration of Independence is basically a list of grievances against the crown. It's telling them all the things that we tried to do that you refused to help with. You wouldn't help us. You wouldn't communicate with us. You wouldn't allow us to have representation or a voice in our government. And so we are going to tell you that because of these grievances that we have, the next step for us is independence. And that's what the Declaration of Independence is doing. So on July 4th, 1776, the delegates signed the Declaration of Independence. All right, so you can see down here at the bottom, this is the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And these are the gentlemen that signed the document. Now, here's what you have to understand. When these gentlemen put their name on this parchment, so you can see, here's the Constitution. Look at the names as they're signed here. Every one of those men that put their name on the Declaration of Independence was committing treason against the British crown, because they were declaring themselves no longer British subjects, but independent Americans. And so they were putting everything on the line. If they lose, these men will lose everything. And what we know now is that many of these men did lose everything. These were usually wealthy landowners. Most of the men that were a part of this delegation were wealthy landowners. And most of them lost their fortunes because they had to pay for the revolution. They paid for it out of their own pockets. And many of them lost their ships. Many of them lost their land. They lost their lives. Some of them lost their families. Many of them were captured and killed. So when they signed their name, they knew that they were putting everything on the line. Right? So these aren't guys that don't have anything to lose. They actually have the most to lose, and yet are going to show such bravery by signing their name to this document. Okay? When you sign your name, it has meaning. And so you can look at it, and I would encourage you to look at they have some great writings about what happens to each one of these men. And it's incredible to see how many of them literally gave everything they had, including their lives, to the revolution. And so you can see in the middle of the document, I don't know if you can see it, but it's right in the middle of the document. You see this very large signature? This is John Hancock. And John Hancock walked up and signed the Declaration of Independence, and he signed his name huge so everybody could read it. He wanted to make sure that the king knew exactly who he was, because he was so proud of what was happening, and he believed that this was the right thing. And so he wanted to make sure that the king knew that John Hancock supported this Declaration of Independence. Now remember how much bravery that would take to know by signing my name, I'm really putting everything on the line. And not only am I going to sign my name, I'm going to make it so large that he can't miss my name. So just think of the bravery by John Hancock there. And also, we use his name a lot. Like if someone passes you a piece of paper and says, put your Hancock on it or put your John Hancock on it, that's what they mean, sign it. Because we know that John Hancock had the biggest signature on the Declaration of Independence. Okay? All right, so let's get back to the Declaration. Remember, it's a list of grievances. And now our government is based on natural rights of people, okay, that God gives man rights, that those are rights that every human being has upon birth, that those are natural rights given to every single human being by God. And our duty of government is to honor those rights, right? So the government is supposed to be set up to be able to protect their people and honor the natural rights that those people have or those citizens have, right? According to the founding fathers in both the Declaration and in the Constitution, natural rights are what we call inalienable rights. Those are rights that cannot be taken away. They're not rights given to us by the government. These are rights that are natural. In other words, they're God-given. And so if you have these God-given rights, the government is never supposed to be powerful enough to take those away, right? And so that's kind of the idea that's established here with the writing of the Declaration of Independence, okay? And like I said, I know you guys have heard this stuff in 8th grade, but I do get kind of excited about it. So I did kind of chase a couple rabbits there, and I apologize. So let's move on to our next slide here, the Revolution. Okay, we have our Declaration. The first shots have been fired at Lexington and Concord. The Declaration of Independence on July 4th has been signed, and now the Revolution is in full force. And the Revolutionary War takes place, and like I said, we won't get into any kind of details. We'll just hit some major points for you, okay? So the Revolutionary War is 1775 to 1783. You know, a lot of people, when we talk about the American Revolution, they say, oh yeah, the American Revolution happened in 1775. Well, it lasted a lot longer than that. It takes from 1775 to 1783. Remember, we're talking about fighting the most powerful military in the world of that time period. So this is not going to be easy. There's going to be a lot of bloodshed. There's going to be a lot of loss for the war effort. One of the low points, I should say, of the American Revolution was the winter at Valley Forge. George Washington wintered his troops here at Valley Forge in 1777, leading into 1778. It's one of the harshest winters that Valley Forge had ever seen. The American troops, many of them died. We were having a hard time at that time being able to support the military. Washington wasn't getting enough food for his soldiers. He didn't have enough uniforms. They really didn't have true uniforms. Most of them were getting uniforms and making them themselves. But they didn't have, shoes and coats and things, things that are necessary for survival. So Valley Forge was a really, really low point for George Washington and his soldiers. But at the same time, what's going to happen is over the course of that winter, as they endure that winter together, it begins to unify the soldiers. They begin to even have more respect for George Washington. And when I say respect, I mean these men are willing to die for him. They're not just, they're not like, oh yeah, he's a good leader. No, they're willing to lay down their lives for George Washington because he is their leader. And so you kind of see a unification that happens. Now, are there people that leave during Valley Forge? Yes, they go home because they're like, I can't do this, or this is taking too long. And, they leave the military without permission. And so that was a problem. The amount of troops began to dwindle. But one of the good things that came out of Valley Forge is Washington used this as a time to drill his soldiers and teach them to be real soldiers and not just militia groups that were, a group of people that were just thrown together. And they become real soldiers, understanding how to fight and how to be disciplined as a soldier. And so those were things that were happening. And of course, the French, we're going to have the French that will also be with us at Valley Forge, that will help George Washington in the drilling process that takes place to help develop our militias into a real fighting military troops. Okay, so he kind of hardens them at Valley Forge. And when they come out of Valley Forge, they still look like a ragtag group, but they're much, much more disciplined, and they understand more about military, the way to conduct themselves as a military unit than they did going into that winter, right? In 1781, we'll get some help from the French. Basically, what had happened is the French had kind of set out the most of it. They kind of wanted to see. Remember, this is seen as an uprising against the British. And so as this uprising is happening, the French are kind of out of it because they want to see, how the British handle it, and it's good for France because that means the British are having to deal with military operations against their own colonies. And so the French are okay with it. But by 1781, they realize that, oh my gosh, this little ragtag military uprising that's taken place in the New World, it's working. And the British still don't have control of those colonies by 1781. So the French are going to decide, they don't just decide out of the blue. You have people like Benjamin Franklin and other Americans that are in France that are talking to the French leadership and saying, look, we need your help. We need you. We need money. We need ships. We need troops. We need your help in this fight. If you'll help us, we believe that we can win the war. And so by 1781, Britain has not stamped out the unrest or the uprising. And so the French began to send troops to help the Americans. The main thing that the French do for the American Revolution is ships, is they send French ships. And that's the biggest help for America because we don't have our own Navy. And so having the French on the seas and using those ships to fight the British is very beneficial to the cause of the American Revolution, right? So you kind of start to see the tide turning towards the Americans. And the Americans, you don't hear, when you really look at the American Revolution, you see how many losses the Americans have. Whether it's battle or the amount of people, we had a huge amount of loss, but we just kept coming. And we just kept fighting, and we just refused to surrender. And so it kind of emboldened not just the other Americans, but other countries around the world are looking at it and going, "Wow, okay, they're doing a good job." And then you get people that begin to not just say, oh, "Okay, that's fine, y'all are fighting," but now you have groups like the French that are, "How can we help you?" Because we believe that you can now win, not just an uprising. We think you can actually win this thing, okay? Then you have General Cornwallis, who's the British commander. He gets himself trapped in the city of Yorktown. The American forces are moving in on him, and by 1781, the British commander, Cornwallis, has to surrender. And so this is a huge, huge blow to the British. And now the Americans are the ones that have turned the tide and are winning these battles. And so we've put the British in a position with the surrender at Yorktown that they have to now talk to the Americans about a possible surrender. And so here's the most powerful country in the world, and you're looking at it and you're, oh my gosh, these little colonies are actually going to win this thing, and they're going to defeat this huge military power. And so in 1783, the Treaty of Paris is signed. So basically what you have are the British are going to show up in Paris. The Americans show up in Paris because it's considered more of a neutral area. And they have to sign a treaty that says that these once colonies are now an independent country. And that country is called the United States of America. And so the Treaty of Paris ends the American Revolution. And now these little colonies that had this little uprising are now ruling themselves. Okay, now here's the hard part. What are you going to do with this brand new nation? You have this new nation. You have this new chance to say, hey, we're going to create our own government. We're going to rule ourselves the way that we want to be ruled. We're not part of you anymore. We're not subjects to a monarch. We're going to be free. We're going to see liberty. Okay? Now, how do you do that? How do you actually create it? Liberty and freedom, those are beautiful words. They have beautiful ideology. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to implement it to actually have a country that's successful? Right? So, and remember, even after 1783, the British, they're going to keep undermining the United States. How can we mess them up? How can we mess up their trade? How can we mess up what they're doing on the seas? How can we disturb their economy? Because they want us to fail. Another important thing that comes out of the Treaty of Paris is that the French recognize us as a nation. Okay, now what happens on the world stage is that when a country declares itself independent, once they've declared themselves independent, anybody can do that. But are you recognized by other countries of the world? Do other nations look at you and say, we recognize you as an independent nation, as an independent country? And if you don't get that recognition, then most nations fail if the recognition is not given by some other country or countries worldwide. And in this case, other empires, other civilizations. And so with the Treaty of Paris, the French recognizes America as an independent nation. Guys, that is so huge for us because this means that we are independent. And now we start down this path of trying to create something that no nation has ever created before. We are going to create a union where individual rights are looked upon as a good thing. We want to create a union where the government is not controlled by a king or a queen. And so this next step is going to be huge for America. Okay? All right. So I'm going to break this actually into several different videos for you so that you don't have to sit through the whole thing. So when we come back to the next video, we're going to start on this slide, which will be talking about the Constitution, the actual establishment of a real government. All right. So I'll see you guys, or I'll talk to you guys in the next video. And again, remember, anytime you have a question, email me or send me a message on Canvas, and I will try to answer any question that I can for you. All right. Okay. We'll see you guys later.